Harald, welcome to the show. You know that we ourselves have talked about this for years, about doing something like this, because I've been sort of listening to you over dinners and different occasions where we've been sort of talking about your career, and we wanted to sort of put a recording together so that we could celebrate the things that you and your family have achieved in the years. But I know that you want to say something very, very special firstly.
Yes, Kevin. I feel honored to be a part of this production, and I please let me dedicate this to a accident that happened in the first few hours of my training in the United States to my roommate. My roommate was Gary Fisk, an American first lieutenant that freshly came from the Air Force Academy to be a pilot for the American Air Force, just like myself. As a German students, we were separated from each other, and we were put together with an American student pilot in one BOQ, Bachelor of Officer Quarter, to learn and improve our American language and of course make friendships as well. Gary Fisk was a honorary student of the Air Force Academy and a brilliant mind. As far as I remember, he had earned the Silver Sabre of the best student of the year of the Air Force Academy. As we started our training in Williams Air Force Base, he was brilliant as far as the academics are concerned, but as far as flying is concerned, he kind of lagged behind. So when I did my 30-hour transition check, that was the first check as a student pilot, he was just about to take off and fly his 3 traffic patterns as a single pilot in the T-37. On takeoff, for whatever reason, he crashed. The aircraft went into a spin and crashed into a cotton field in the extension of the runway line. I lost my roommate, which I had began a close friendship with, and that was the first shock in my training ground. This is why I would like to dedicate this to him. Now, coming back to my parents and grandparents' life in Germany during the First and Second World War, my grandfather came from the German cavalry. Cavalrysts were recruited to do the first balloon captives. The balloon captives were tethered balloons up to flying about up to 300, 400 feet high, and with a basket below it, and the soldier in there with binoculars was supposed to review the movements in the part of the enemy's area, and then relay it to the artillery down there. Of course, these people didn't have any parachutes, so if one of the things was shot down, they had to stick with it. From there, the First World War developed into a lighter-than-air flying and attacking aircraft. The first thing they did is they, like the British and the Italians, the Germans had the so-called Zeppelin. Maybe you know what a Zeppelin was. It was an airship, lighter than air, and it was propelled by an engine with a big basket underneath where the soldiers were sitting in, and they were throwing the bombs by hand into the enemy lines. They went all the way to London at night, since they found out that airships could be shot down with one bullet. So they were too vulnerable. In the 1960s, the first heavier than air aircraft arrived. So he went from the Zeppelin onto the Fokker D-2.
Yes,
which was in,
and we've got a picture of that.
Yes, okay.
Right now.
We have got a picture.
Yeah.
It was a double-decker, and the first ones had a second pilot soldier in there. They were shooting at other aircraft with a rifle or with pistols. Later on, they attached a machine gun, either in the wing or in the propeller nose. He survived this, although these pilots also had to stick with the aircraft, because when they were shot down there was no parachute. And he survived this and ended in the 1918s, the First World War.
Your father, after that, your father was building, and along with the rest of the family, really, cousins and uncles, were building gliders. They were members and flyers of the local gliding club, or sailing plane club as they were known out there. And it was when the Second World War started, it was anybody that was associated with aeroplanes in the form of gliders were seconded immediately into the Luftwaffe Air Force, which was your father, and of course your cousin, which his cousin will come on to.
I have to get a little bit, just a little bit into the history. Now, after the First World War, besides other restrictions, the Germans also were forbidden to build powered aircraft. So what they did is they did build powered aircraft, but together with the Russians in Russia, to hide it from the Allies in the West. My father, of course, was in Germany and lived in Germany, so he and his brother and his cousin, they built gliders, and they flew gliders. And when the Second World War broke out, the German Air Force leadership recruited mainly pilots out of glider clubs. So immediately, when they broke out of the Second World War, they were recruited to train and fly powered aircraft. There was an abundance of powered aircraft that were shipped from Russia back to Germany, and he finally wound up onto the Heinkel HE-111. That was the aircraft that he was flying.
And that was a twin-engine bomber.
It was a twin-engine bomber, and he was flying it, accompanying General Rommel in
North Africa.
North Africa. And when the Nazi forces were driven out of North Africa, they were sent to the west.
The Western Front. Now your father then, when he was flying the Heinkel 111, he was on bombing missions to London and to Coventry, where
that's correct.
Badly. And also, I believe that he may have been involved in a mission to try and blow up Tower Bridge in London, which we're glad to say was unsuccessful.
Absolutely crazy.
Well, I think that in the history that I've been reading, Hitler at the time was very sensitive to historic buildings. And sensitive to it, so he wanted to preserve anything that was historic. So he was against that bombing exercise, from what I can pick out. But anyway, your father was on a mission, and he got shot down in the English Channel.
That's correct.
Picked up by some fishermen, local fishermen. Tell us about that, Harald.
Yes, I don't know what was going on in the mind of the leadership of the German Air Force. For one reason, I think they just wanted to angry the British by destroying the Tower Bridge. They had no tactical or strategic advantage in the course of the Second World War, but they tried to do it. Since they couldn't do it during the day because they were shut down, they did it at night, and whatever happened, he was shot down and landed in the channel, and was lucky enough to be picked up. And then, as many other German pilots, he went into the prisoner of war camp in Canada,
where he served the rest of
where he spent
4 years.
where he spent the rest of his life in Canada. His brother also was shot down, but over Germany, and was injured very hard. So for him, the Air Force or Luftwaffe was over. His cousin.
Well, I was going to come on to his cousin because, not by coincidence, you share a name, Hartman,
Yes.
with Eric Hartman, which is your brother's cousin,
Yes.
who held the most number of kills, 352, I think it was.
That's right.
During the Second World War.
That's correct. That's correct.
And that was your father's cousin.
It was a
Yeah.
cousin,
Yeah.
second or third
Yeah.
grade, because the Hartman family, there was the Hartman family.
Yes.
So
Yes.
there's where also my name comes from.
Yes.
This we called him Booby.
Yeah.
Booby Hartman was really, he was one of the big aces in the Second World War.
Yes. Yes.
I might have to mention that most of the planes that he shot down were Russian
Were
planes,
Russian, yeah.
because he was at the Russian front, where he was also captured after the Second World War. He didn't make it onto the American side, and he was captured there and went into one of the gulags, where he was released, I think 1953 or 1954, and then refused to build up the East German - Russian Air Force, and finally was released and came to West Germany. You know, Adenauer did a lot of good work there,
Yes.
of releasing prisoners of war, and helped building up the new F104 force in Germany. I might mention he didn't like the 104, but that has some other reasons which I'm not sure about.
So that kind of covers your forefathers
Yes,
before
yes.
you, and you probably, of course, you were too young to remember any of that, with the
Yes.
exception of when your father had returned from Canada.
Yes.
And at the time, of course, nobody talked about their experiences, so
eh,
you knew nothing really about.
He
what
didn't want to
happened.
talk about it at all, and he was very sick too, because in northern Africa he had retrieved the malaria africana, the bad part of the malaria, and in the years following in Germany, in the 50s, he had these malaria attacks once in a while, and eventually died from it.
Right.
This is what gave me
Yeah.
the freedom of getting into the aviation,
Yes.
because he refused to let me enter any aviation professionalship.
So, but when you were at school, one of your greatest interests and hobbies and sports was judo. You were actually the second champion or second in line champion of the country in Germany when you were the age of 16.
Yes, yes. That was in the youth part of the judo championships. It was in 1957, if I'm not mistaken. And they sent four of us to the dojo Kodokan in
Japan.
Tokyo,
Yeah.
to improve our skills, our judo skills. So we did that during our school holidays. So we were 6 weeks gone, coming back as very proud
I'm sure. Yeah.
youngsters with a black belt
Yes.
that we had achieved.
And I'm sure that this must have been very, very instrumental in preparing you to become a fighter pilot on the 104 when the training took place a year or so later.
Yes.
Because you now,
yes.
at the age of 16, you're making an application to go
Well,
into
yeah.
the paratroop regiment.
Initially, it gave me, of course, an advantage during the entry into the Air Force, into the Luftwaffe, as a paratrooper, because I was physically very fit due to this, and which later on, of course, led to an apprenticeship and to the aviation training. It started with a letter going through all military outfits, looking for young men who wanted to become a pilot.
And at this time, the government of the day had already announced that they were going to be committed to buy the F104
Yes.
under the NATO
Yes. That is
treaty
correct.
agreement.
Well, actually, none of us didn't really know how the F104 looked like.
Didn't even know what it
No,
looked
we
like.
just saw maybe a picture in the newspaper or whatever, and we didn't know what was coming to us. But yes, we were determined to fly this particular aircraft
Yes.
because it had the speed record, the high altitude record, the climbing record. It was one of the most potential fighters at that time.
Yes, yes. So you now have made the application. You've been accepted as the first 500 to go
That's
through
correct.
the
Yes.
initial screening, basically.
Yes.
Was it in Hamburg?
Yes. They invited us to Hanover
Hanover.
for a 1-week screening to find out who might be able to be a pilot and then a fighter pilot, and did a whole bunch of tests with us. It starts with the centrifuge and the low altitude chamber and of course, besides physical tests, mental tests, physics, mathematics. They wanted to know how good our English was and things like that. It took about 1 week, and out of these 500 people, that's what I was told, 24 were left over, and that was the first company that was invited to Uetersen, a small little grass airport.
Right.
About 25 kilometers north of Hamburg.
And that's when you first flew an actually powered aeroplane.
Yes.
During your training, which you had 10 hours
Yes.
to go solo.
That's right. It was a yellow Piper L-18, a so-called tail dragger, one with the two main wheels at the tail.
We have a picture here.
Yes, like you see on the picture, that's exactly the aircraft they put us on. They put us onto the front seat, and the instructor initially, of course, on the back seat. They were all old Air Force, Luftwaffe and Air Force pilots that had survived the Second World War. And they gave us 10 hours to figure out whether we would not get airsick, and we would be able to fly 3 solo patterns with this aircraft on this grass airport there in Hamburg.
And that's 24 of you.
There was 24 of us, and by the end of the day, there was eight pilots over. So 8 pilots out of the 24 were selected and said, all right, you guys, you're going to do what we want you to do. You're going to go into the United States and train to be a fighter pilot.
Right. That must have been great. So you now know that you're going to be a pilot. You're going to be trained
at that time, yes. All 8 of us, of course, went solo with less than 10 hours on this aircraft, and managed to make 3 safe landings. Not very pretty landings, but safe landings. Yes, and we were very proud, and not knowing what was coming.
So, Harry, when you were in Uetersen, you had the privilege actually to meet Sir Arthur Harris, or Bomber Harris as he was better known as, and he gave all of you young students
Yes.
an address and a talking to, really about
Yes.
his.
It was Air Marshal Sir Harris, General Harris, and I consider it to be an historical meeting. He was touring German in 1961-62, touring German Air Force bases, probably political bases too, I'm not sure. But we met him in Uetersen. We were invited for an afternoon of discussion, and of course the discussion ended up with Dresden. It had to, and General Harris told us why they had made the decision to wipe the city out of or off this planet. And he associated this with the General Truman's, or President Truman's decision to bomb Hiroshima and 2 days later Nagasaki. Because at that time the Americans had not overrun most of the Japanese islands, and they figured if they had to do this, they would lose another 100 to 150,000 soldiers.
That's right, because they had so much
Correct.
involvement in the Pacific Fleet, in that
Correct.
Pacific region.
Correct.
And it was putting all of their
Yes.
forces at high risk. Yes.
So what the British said is, if we constitute a red line and said, this far you can go and no further, because we are wiping out the cities behind your enemy line, the soldiers would give up. At that time they were in Russia and almost close to Moscow. Like Napoleon many years before. But it didn't work. When they wiped out Dresden, it got even worse with the German soldiers. They did not give up. They did not throw the weapons away. On the contrary, they started fighting even more. So it was a misconception, a miscalculation. But of course, Harris and his troops could not foresee this.
Mm-hmm.
This was the basic of this discussion, and we understood why it was done, considering why Truman did this in Southeast Asia. Now, Truman was successful because a day after the bomb was dropped over Nagasaki, the Japanese threw the towel.
Yes, yeah. Which wasn't the case, of course, in Germany.
Yes.
It was, as you say, it was a miscalculated risk.
It was a miscalculated risk.
And of course, Harris, Sir Arthur Harris, at that time, afterwards, he wasn't particularly popular in the country for the bloodshed, if you like, that
Yes.
was brought on Dresden. And I think he spent some years in South Africa before returning to Europe, and it was about that time after the dust
I didn't know this. I only thought it was a fruitful discussion that we had with him, a couple of hours, and to make us understood why sometimes these type of decisions are made, in military.
Yes, quite. So the first thing, so you phoned your mother up to let her know.
I phoned up my mother and said, "Hey, mother, I'm coming home for a couple of weeks, and then I will leave, and you won't see me," and my sisters, of course, for the next 3 years, because I'm going into the United States of America. They almost fell flat on their back, and I said, "Please arrange and make sure that I can sell my motorbike." Was a BMW 500cc, was at that time the biggest BMW, and a little car, it was a Fiat Neca 1000cc. So within those 2 weeks I sold everything, and packed a very, very small luggage bag with a shaver and some toothpaste, and made my way back up to Hamburg, from there to Uetersen, where we were prepared to go into the States.
Right. So you've gone. This is the first 4 of the 8.
That's right, the first 4.
Yeah. And you were actually the leader of the gang because you.
Correct.
Were elected to
of the first 4, the leader of them, the speaker. We were all between 19 and maybe 21.
Right.
That was about our age.
Yeah. So you now got your tickets to fly to America.
Yes.
And you're in Hamburg, and you know you're going to be flying the Super Constellation, which was a Lufthansa flight, which went from Hamburg to Reykjavik, and then on to New York.
From Reykjavik to New York.
And you were really so excited. You bought flowers for the flight attendants, or the air hostesses, as they were.
Yeah, you have to understand. At that time, none of us had ever been even close to an airliner. We had never been able to look into an airliner. We never flew with an airliner. So we were all very excited, yes. And we bought, on the airport in Hamburg, we bought a big bunch of nice flowers, and I had to present the flowers to the chief stewardess on the Lufthansa flight. To say and to precise it, the Super Constellation was also called the best 3-engine Atlantic cross aircraft of that time.
That was its nickname, and tell me why it had that nickname.
Yeah, the nickname it was because it had 4 engines, conventional engines, not jet engines, and quite often one of the engine gave up on crossing the Atlantics, but there was no problem for a 4-engine aircraft, so they continued with 3 engines. A little bit slower. They used most probably a little bit less fuel. I'm not sure about this. Yeah. And yes, it was called.
Well, we've got a picture of the Lufthansa.
You have that.
And of course the cockpit, which you all couldn't wait to get up and take a look at.
Yes, they invited us as future pilots. They were friendly enough to invite us into the cockpit, and I saw first time a cockpit and all these instruments, which I couldn't believe in. And I noticed there was a 5-man cockpit crew, and there was the captain, the first officer, the flight engineer, the navigator, and somebody that did the communication, communication specialist. Yeah. And we started in Hamburg wearing our military winter uniforms, because it was -5 or -6 degrees. It was in January. It was very cold there. And now I'd like to tell you what happened when we came to New York. Now Reykjavik was cold, of course. We just stuck our nose out.
It was an 18-hour flight. It was a long flight, wasn't it?
It was altogether an 18-hour flight. In New York, it was not winter at all at that time. We had around 20 or 20 something centigrade degree plus, of course. And we thought well, nobody ever had been in an aircraft, nor abroad, by far not in the United States or New York. We thought, my goodness, there are some places in the world that have summer temperatures, and we stayed overnight in New York, and then were put onto an American airline aircraft and flew to San Antonio. And that's when the big shock came, because San Antonio had 30 plus, and we in our winter uniforms. Luckily, the German outfit there made sure that we quickly were receiving our khaki uniforms. None of us had ever seen a khaki uniform, a light khaki uniform. that made it a little bit easier. And we landed on Lackland Air Force Base in San Antonio, which is one of the biggest multicultural Air Force bases in the United States, with about 60, 70,000 foreigners that are training there. Not flight training. It was just a training of air policemen, of ground personnel, and of course of pilots. What we did is we had academics there again, and a lot of English lessons. Because if you imagine you had that school English here in Germany and come back to Texas, you hardly understood one word.
Yeah. Okay, Harry, that's great. We've got you now into San Antonio, Texas. We're going to take a break now, and when we come back in part 2, we'll be talking about the time in Lakeland, in San Antonio, and then we had to move on, but we had to buy a car first. We had to move from there to Williams Air Force Base.
Yes, yes, and I was
come back, watch it in part 2, but don't forget you need to subscribe, ring the bell, click like, send us a comment, and do all of that, and we'll keep you informed.